So there's quite a lot of drama right now on the internet because it seems like Vanguard, the anti-cheat for Valorant and League of Legends, are breaking cheaters' computers. And this essentially asks the question, well, if they can break the cheaters' computers, what about you and me and people who aren't cheating, but again, may be detected as cheating because these anti-cheats aren't completely, 100% accurate in who they detect. And as well, there's like this ethical thing about, well, you might be cheating in a video game, but should a company that thinks that someone is cheating be allowed to break your computer? Well, my name is Martin. I'm a senior penetration tester and I lead a penetration testing team. And that's what we should take a look at today. Now, this starts like every other good story on X, formerly known as Twitter, where Ogesada said that there's been a new update to Vanguard anti-cheat, which blocks the majority of the DMA cheats that are being used. And then posting a bunch of screenshots from stuff like unknown cheats and here on Discord, showing that people are kind of upset that their hardware cheats are no longer working. This they made Riot Games go out, being a little bit tongue-in-cheek and say congrats to the owners of the brand new 6K paperweights, and then posting this picture of what seems to be a bunch of these DMA cheats. Because a DMA cheat is these specific cards. It is physical pieces of hardware that you plug into your computer, which can read and write to memory. Essentially being able to read out data from the Valorant video game memory and then writing to it as well. So you can, for example, change where you're looking or maybe remove walls or somehow manipulate whatever is going on your side of the game. How does that work? Why DMA? Essentially, on something like Windows, there are processes, and these processes have protected memory. So one process can't just read and write or execute stuff in another process. You can do this by opening handles and doing different techniques, but this is detectable. You can monitor what processes are trying to read or write or do stuff to other processes. And this is like the fundamental baseline of something like an antivirus or an EDR product, which will do this to try to detect and prevent malware from executing, and also for anti-cheats. Because again, what you need when you're writing a cheat is read and write to a specific game's memory, depending on what you want to do. Now, DMA is not. If you plug in specific hardware into your computer, it can usually read and write to whatever memory it wants. And that of course allows you to just bypass a lot of this, making it much harder to detect. There are ways to try to detect it, but there are a lot of ways around it. And this is kind of where this, again, as always, this fight between the anti-cheat and the cheaters are, showing up. Now, since Vanguard is so good, Valorant has been essentially primarily dominated by these DMA and hardware cheaters, because doing it purely in software is very, very hard and very, very time consuming. It's essentially just easier to buy hardware, plug it in and use that than trying to, get some software bypass. Now, it's kind of crazy that people are buying physical hardware to cheat in video games. You can just not play the video game or be better at it, but that's a different story. Now, Riot had to come out and essentially make a long kind of post saying about how this worked and what was going on. Now, it's not very clear, not always the best written, so this Q&A that they did after was actually a little bit better, answering the most kind of common question that people were asking, like, does Vanguard physically damage hardware? And they answered no. So what actually is going on, and should you be concerned, and should you stop, should you uninstall Vanguard or not? Of course, this is always up to you, but what essentially is happening is that if you want to play Valorant, it seems like you need to now enable something called IOMMU. Now, that is the input and output memory management unit, and essentially when we talked about how if you have these hardware cheats, this DMA, and you plug it in, it can just read and write to memory as much as it wants. If you enable IOMMU, you can stop that. The IOMMU will almost work a little bit like how it works in software, where it will detect and say, well, there are certain rules for what this piece of hardware is allowed to read to and write to and do stuff in memory. And this is usually used for certain security features. For example, some people use it if they have a virtual machine and they want to grant certain access to a specific piece of hardware and give that to the virtual machine, but they don't want that hardware to then be allowed to do stuff on their host machine. For example, passing a GPU to your VM, but you don't want it to necessarily have access to other stuff than that specific VM's memory. Then you can use something like IOMMU, enable that in your BIOS, and then you can start using this feature to kind of restrict what the graphics card is allowed to do. And that is what Vanguard has been doing. If you want to play Valorant, you need to enable IOMMU, and then Vanguard will say, okay, here's all the hardware. I will not allow this specific hardware here to read and write to Vanguard or to Valorant. And if it tries, well, then it will stop it from doing so, shutting down the game or whatever. If you don't use Vanguard, if you're not playing Valorant, if you're trying to use that specific hardware to access another process memory like a VM or Counter-Strike or another video game, then that's fine. Vanguard shouldn't stop you because you're not trying to access Valorant or any other Riot games like League of Legends. But if you're trying to access specifically a Riot games, then Vanguard will stop that specific piece of hardware from doing so. And this, of course, can cause some instabilities because we are talking about doing stuff in the kernel. So stuff might be unstable and it might blue screen. It's kind of the risk of operating this low, having that great detection, but of course, adding some risks if something goes wrong. Again, your computer might blue screen, you might have to go into your BIOS and disable IOMMU, which if you do, you won't be allowed to play Valorant anymore. So did Vanguard break other people's computers? It seems like the answer is no. What it did was, if you had this specific piece of hardware which is used to cheat at Riot games like Valorant, then that specific piece of hardware doesn't serve that function anymore because it is being blocked by this IOMMU rules that they have implemented. So that specific hardware is a paperweight because the function that it is bought for, it cannot serve anymore. Of course, you can repurpose that to do something else or cheat at another game, but specifically for Valorant, you can't use it anymore, making it worthless. But it didn't brick this specific piece of hardware. The hardware still works, you didn't need to do anything to fix it. That's at least what Riot says. Additionally, it seems like this only affects if you are specifically trying to access Valorant, and it is pretty on brand for Riot. Riot has been very strict in their rulings for their anti-cheat, especially when it comes to Valorant. You need to be using TPM, now you need to have IOMMU turned on, and there might be other settings in the future that they will enable to make it harder and more costly for cheats to be implemented and used. We talked about this previously on the channel, but essentially the job of an anti-cheat is the same as the job of any antivirus, EDR, or security product. It is not to stop all form of malicious actors, it is to try to increase the cost of performing attacks, that it becomes less and less obtainable for the masses by increasing the cost of development of exploit. In Valorant's case, people had to buy physical hardware, and now it's even more difficult to get that physical hardware out. If it is detected, then it might be stopped and blocked, and then people will have to maybe re-buy new hardware every single time, again increasing the cost of cheaters. Now again, if you're not comfortable having a company having this amount of access on your device, then the only way to solve that is to uninstall, all the Riot games and, uninstall Vanguard. But for everyone else, it seems like this will only affect cheaters, even though I wouldn't be surprised if some people are caught at the crossfire because they are doing all other weird stuff on their computers, and that somehow gets conflicted with cheating. But as long as you're not, the worst case scenario should be that you won't be allowed to play Valorant anymore. If you're using those kind of weird things, it shouldn't have any negative effects on your hardware. I hope you like this video. If you do, like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.